Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the latest interview episode of One Nation Under Whiskey. I remain, as always, Jason, Neil, Patrick, Harris, Johnston, Yellen. You're welcome. It's good to be with you, Nation. I am solo today from an interview side of things. However, I am in Tucson, Arizona for the ACSA, the ACSA, the American Craft Spirits Association Conference. I have the pleasure of being at Delback, wonderful Arizona distillery, with Caitlin Bartlemay. And Caitlin, hello, Caitlin.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here at Delback.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, you and I were talking before we hit record about how to properly introduce you and your professional connection. Mm-hmm. To be clear to our listeners, you have nothing to do with Delback.
Correct.
And I have nothing to do with Delback. And yet this is where we find ourselves because of the conference.
Sure.
So please, you are Caitlin Bartlemay.
Yep. Mm-hmm. I am the master distiller for Clear Creek Distillery and Hood River Distillers. And as a part of that, it also includes McCarthy's whiskey. So I know I told you that I have a story to make this all make sense, so I'll go ahead and lead into it, right? So I use the solar system because it's something that we're all should be, hopefully, familiar with,
okay.
Right? So Hood River Distillers in this story represents the sun, right? So and all these planets, all these brands revolve around Hood River Distillers. Because this is my story, I get to pick the best planet, which means I pick Saturn because it's obviously the coolest planet. So Saturn, the actual planet itself, will represent Clear Creek Distillery. All of our fruit brandies and liqueurs, the story and heritage of Steve McCarthy and our founding in 1985, right?
Indeed.
The rings of Saturn at this point represent McCarthy's American single malt. Very important to the Clear Creek story, right? The first American single malt, first distilled by Steve in 1994, first released in 1998. But as you can imagine from a portfolio perspective, having all these fruit brandies and liqueurs, and then also a smoky peaty American single malt, there are some events in some places that one brand might go and then the other maybe doesn't go. And so they're being increasingly treated like independent brands, but their stories are really tightly connected and really important to one another. And so that's why I explain it like Saturn and its rings, right?
I like
Technically
that.
Two different things, but a part of a whole. And then because we've been purchased by Hood River Distillers in 2014, and they are for a long time, they started in 1934 doing the same thing Clear Creek was founded doing, making fruit liqueurs from the bounty of the Pacific Northwest. And they changed to a rectifier blender in the late 50s and early 60s because for some reason Americans are afraid of the word brandy, which has essentially been the defining part of what I do as far as educating consumers is brandy's not scary, let me tell you why.
There you go.
And so they're essentially a brand house, and if they were a software company, I think you'd probably refer to them as an incubator, right? They have over 30 brands across 300 SKUs, and so Clear Creek's part of that is that Clear Creek itself is a brand that has many SKUs within it, but we're also creating, as a distilling team, some independent brands for the larger company as well. So you'll see things like Timberline Vodka are going to be produced by Clear Creek Distillery, and then wonderful young men, Everett Rubin and Garrett Trotter Ramos, that are back doing the Lord's work at the distillery so that I can be here in Tucson with you. But we're also producing things like the DeGraff Amaro and Aperitivo and Old Delicious double bourbon barreled apple brandy, and a few other things for the larger company that are these independent brands amongst the 30 that they own.
Understood. This is lovely. So obviously, I want to talk to you about your responsibilities there. What are you doing on site, off site? What does a day look like? What does distillation look like? We clearly want to get into talking about American single malt whiskey today. But I want to come back to the beginning for Caitlin, is when you and I were touring Delback with a larger group here that includes our beloved Anna Hinz of Westland, who introduced the two of us. As we were touring through here, you made mention of your parents having a winery in Oregon. And so I'm curious, what does a little bit of the backstory look like for Caitlin? And then what was the spark that brought you into the spirits realm?
Sure. A lot of people say that my trajectory to being the master distiller is fairly linear, and I understand what they mean when they look at the whole story. But I would say that even 3 years ago, I wouldn't have seen myself in this position. I've just been focused on learning as much as I can, and Mark gives an amazing tour here at Del Bach, and I totally agree with him when he said earlier, the longer you spend in this industry, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't actually know, right? And so I was incredibly confident 2 years into my distilling career, and I lament the passing of those days on a regular basis, because there's nothing just like teenagers know everything, so too do young distillers, right? We know everything. It all makes sense. It's all very simple and easy. My personal journey, I grew up on a Century Wheat Ranch in Eastern Oregon. So, my dad was an actual real cowboy. He grew up riding 2 horses into the ground every day as a part of, working on the family farm. They got rid of the cows when I was 3, so I was never a horse girl. But I was definitely my dad's right-hand man from a very young age. So I started, up at the shop working on equipment with my dad by the age of 7, because 7-year-olds can get into a lot of tight spaces, and they have nimbly little fingers that can find bolts and nuts that have been dropped through engine compartments. By the time, my first ATV, four-wheeler, whatever you want to call them, side by side, was a Massey Ferguson lawnmower that my dad took the blade off of, because the only thing that was holding me back from riding four-wheelers to do more work from him was my legs weren't long enough. And so as soon as my legs were long enough to be able to hit the brakes and change the gears, I was off to the races, which I think I probably hit by, I want to say 8 or 9, because the Lord blessed me with the same stature that my dad had, which I think he was probably pretty pleased with, because that meant I could do more work and lift heavier things. But my dad, he got the fermentation bug and started fermenting things in the basement, as dads are wont to do.
Okay.
And then I think depending on the day, he would maybe say fortunately or unfortunately, he's really good at it. And he got cajoled and convinced by our friends that he should go pro. And so trying to, support a young family, the farm realistically was never really able to support even our small family of 4. And both my parents always had full-time jobs in order to keep everything together. So it was really everybody kind of shoulder to the wheel to keep this going. And we used to joke, but it was very true that it was a lifestyle and not a living. And so he was, trying to figure out how to diversify. We were only soft white winter wheat in the middle of the desert. And with the growing kind of wine boom in Oregon in the 90s, he was like, well, I make this much an acre in soft white winter wheat in the desert. If I could grow grapes, even a few acres of grapes, that's a hell of a payout. And so we were the first family to ever plant a non-cereal crop in that region, as far as we know in the history of that region, realistically. Wow. And so we had to do a lot of educating with our neighbors for overspray and everything like that. But I was on the ground floor of starting a vineyard and a winery in middle school. So I was
in middle school.
In middle school. So I was dad's, assistant winemaker, and I was out in the vines, and I would, we had a bunch of really wonderful friends and family that would volunteer to do work, because it's fun when it's just a weekend. And I was training adults how to prune and take care of vines, and spent time, going to grocery stores to do tastings with the wine and teach. So I've been teaching adults how to drink alcohol for a couple decades now, even though I've only been a distiller for 15 years.
Is a middle schooler allowed to teach adults how to drink wine?
So by the time I was 18, when you're underage, you can't serve behind a bar, but you can take orders. So interestingly enough, that meant that I couldn't work behind the tasting room bar at that was next to the house. But they could load me up in a pickup full of cases of wine and send me 2 hours away to Portland, Oregon, the biggest city nearby, to do tasting rooms in large grocery stores.
So
that was
classic.
Totally okay with the liquor laws and my server's permit, but couldn't work behind the bar at home, where I would obviously be most comfortable.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Very quickly, for foreign listeners here, You're making mention of white wheat.
Yes.
We know from some producers here in America, they'll talk about red wheat. Can you very quickly give us a 101 on white and red wheat?
I don't know if I am the proper person to give you a 101 on the difference between white and red. They are two different things. I can tell you that we were largely growing Stevens, which was the variety that was developed by Oregon State. I don't remember what decade it was created, but it is soft white winter wheat is going to be used for things like noodles and crackers. It's low protein. So it's really great for a distilling perspective. It's often used for distilling, especially for like vodka spirits and stuff like that, because of its low protein content. And it often gives like a soft creaminess to the spirit that you're working with. I do know that red is a thing, but I've never grown it or handled it. So I don't feel like I'm the person to be able to actually lay out the differences between the two.
I just figured after years of having Maker's Mark talk about red winter wheat, I was like, I feel safe asking Caitlin this question, and she'll do a lovely job here. So
appreciate it.
I understand it wasn't your family's expertise growing up. And I didn't mean to throw you under the bus.
No worries.
Okay, so that was the white. Thank you for that. You had the grape.
So we did the grapes. We did the vineyard.
Made it up here to
My
grapes.
parents wanted me to get a degree because that was something that they weren't afforded an opportunity to do, and I was interested in fermentation and stuff, and so I'm very fortunate that Oregon State University is not only an ag college but has a really robust food science program as a part of that college. So that for me was the biggest no-brainer part of my career to this point. Was absolutely I was going to go to Oregon State. Absolutely I was going to get a food science degree, and it was during my time at university that I got the spark of learning about spirits, and it was mostly because there was so little information available about spirits. There wasn't consumer groups, there weren't spirits podcasts, there weren't Discord servers full of whiskey nerds, there weren't, all of the wonderful publications really that have come out in the last 10 years. None of that existed 15, 16, 17 years ago when I first started getting interested in spirits. And, the wonderful part about our industry is while you can come at it and approach it from, a second tertiary learning perspective, it's still very much an apprenticeship, right? And so I was like, all right, I need to just get a job at the distillery because it seems like the only way that I'm actually going to get the answers that I need is to just do it on the job. And I was very fortunate that I was hired the day after my last final by Steve McCarthy, who is one of the godfathers of craft spirits here in the United States, being the third craft distillery in the country, and started on the bottling line. And I think I bullied my way onto the stills within 6 months. After a year, I was handling a lot of the domestic shipping, in fact, all the domestic shipping for our spirits across the country, and dabbling a little bit in some of the export stuff as well. And then Steve was ready to retire at the ripe age of 71, which I think he earned after having the distillery for 30 years. And he actually reached out to Hood River Distillers because they had, they were a renowned family-owned business. They were local, and they had a great, everybody knows that they take really good care of all of their reputation. That's the word I wanted.
Nice.
They had a great reputation for taking really good care of their employees. And that was really paramount in Steve's mind. He wasn't as concerned about finding somebody that was going to continue his legacy. He was mostly concerned with somebody that was going to take care of his employees.
Nice.
And so the acquisition went through, and you hear horror stories about craft brands getting acquired. Hood River Distiller is still a small family company. I think in total we have 60 employees, and that includes the distillers, the entire sales team.
Or 60?
60.
60.
Yeah. Including all the bottling staff, everything. And from day one, they came into the distillery and they're like, all right, so here's the deal. You guys are really good at making amazing spirits, and we're really good at doing all the bottling and the paperwork. So we're going to take that off your plate, because who really wants to do that? And we're going to have you guys focus on continuing to make really amazing and beautiful liquids. And really, to this day, that is how they have treated the relationship as we have integrated with Hood River Distillers, and even worked on other products for the larger company.
So are you in the same facility that you were in? I remember two parts to this, where I first met Steve maybe around 2002, maybe around 2004, and he was in the very small facility that was up in what I would call the Pearl District. I don't know if he was just across a road or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, I don't know if it's officially called the Alphabet District, but it was like just above the Pearl District,
Okay.
the Alphabet District. So
Okay.
everything goes alphabetically by street name, which is a really great way to organize things. So he was on 23rd and Quimby. That was the original distillery.
Right.
Yep, which is now a tequila bar.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
okay.
the Matador.
And the day I saw him, and I told you this over email, he was so excited about the spruce tip.
Yeah.
Eau de vie?
No, Douglas fir.
Douglas fir, I'm
Douglas fir
sorry.
tip. Yep.
The Douglas fir tip, eau de vie. Was it the eau de vie?
Yep.
That was the part I was worried about getting wrong. And it was the very beginning part that I got wrong.
Sure.
So the
No
Douglas
worries.
fir was...
Spruce tip way more common than Douglas fir buds, for sure. So like that is a totally fair comment.
And I was there to talk about the peated American single malt that he was making that we will still circle back to
Yeah,
later.
no worries.
But that's what I was there to talk to him about. And then I think it was in 2009, 2010, the ADI had their conference in Portland, and I went on a tour to this new, I'm making air
So,
quotes
for fun,
here. Right.
I was definitely there.
Okay, see, I was wondering about that. I was going to ask you that very question.
I was hired in June of 2010, so I was like peak Dirty Under the Stairs kid when ADI came through. I didn't get to attend much of the conference, but Steve was the keynote speaker that year.
Okay,
and so
right,
everybody
yes.
at the distillery was there at the dinner to hear Steve give the keynote speech.
Right.
So, yep, I was there.
Oh man, that's a small world, isn't it? And so all of this to ask the question, are you still distilling in what to me was the new larger facility back in 2010?
So, the 2010 facility that was going to be on 24th and Wilson, that's where I started my career in distilling. After the acquisition by Hood River Distillers in 2014, we were there for a number of years, and Joseph O'Sullivan, my predecessor and really wonderful friend, he actually started with the brand in 2005 and left in 2009. And so he was there at the original facility and then moved into the one that you had been to. And then when Hood River Distillers decided to move us from Portland to Hood River, Joseph was back in Portland after spending time in New York, making the first gin to be distilled in New York City, because of course he did. Him and his wife had moved back to Portland, and he was hired to move the distillery again and become the head and then master distiller for Clear Creek Distillery. So Joseph remains the only Clear Creek employee that's ever worked in all three locations.
Oh, that's awesome.
But all that to say, we have since moved on from that location, and we're now in Hood River Distillers, or Hood River, which is closer to where the actual main bottling plant is, and really closer to the fruit. When we were in Portland, when we're talking about Clear Creek, we buy, upwards of 500,000 pounds of Bartlett pears to turn into pear brandy between September and February every year. Wow. And in Portland, we're like an hour and a half truck drive away from the orchards. Where we are in Hood River, we're literally surrounded by, but there's an airplane museum on one side, and then we're surrounded by orchards on every other side. Wow. And about the most crazy thing that's ever happened in the distillery is that a cow almost wandered in one day. So it's a little bit of a different vibe than being down in Northwest Industrial Portland, for sure. And fruit fly mitigation is a whole different game, and the difference between being in Northwest Industrial, everything's concrete and asphalt, and being in the middle of orchards, because it was always a little bit of a problem in the fall where we were, but now with all the windfall pears that are in the orchards around us, the minute it turns just a little bit cool and the distillery is still nice and warm and smells like fruit, it's like 2 weeks of just absolute Armageddon when it comes to the fruit flies. And it is a bloodbath.
So what does one do?
Well, mostly you just keep everything super, 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 super clean. So if all the drains are nice and clean and everything, then there's no place for them to hang out and have a snack. And then we also this podcast not sponsored by Aunt Fanny's, but we discovered this really great product called Aunt Fanny's, and it's they come in these little jars and they have pop tops on them, and we will zip tie them to like handles and places and pieces of equipment all around the distillery. I'm pretty sure it's just apple cider vinegar, water, and a little bit of dish soap. But it works great, especially because you can pop the tops and close them.
We make those in our house.
So we deploy them all over the distillery, and sometimes it only takes a day for them to fill up, and then you just swap it out. We go through a case every fall, and then the onslaught is over. It's like the zombie horde. You kill the last one, and then everything's pretty pretty much manageable with just general sanitation after that.
This is so good. This is exactly what we always try to achieve with this podcast, is we have wandered so far from where we started.
I know, you want to talk about American Single Malt, and here I am talking about murdering whole generations of fruit flies.
And 100% not your fault. We're just having a conversation like we would talk to each other.
Sure.
This is tremendous. This is so good. Thank you so much.
Oh, of course.
So recognize it. I will say to you, surprise, surprise, we are actually sponsored by Aunt Fanny's. No, we're not. Imagine if we were. Imagine if we were. So let's get a bit nerdier. Let's get a bit geeky. And before we really, narrow our focus to American single malt whiskey, talk to me about the products that you've got going through your facility. Talk to me about your responsibilities there, and talk to me about, again, that's why the Fireflies were genuinely so interested. Talk to me about some of the hurdles you have to overcome. Talk to me about some of the successes that are particular to what you've got going on. Very broad, open-ended statement, question, but we're just having a conversation.
Sure, absolutely. There's just like so many stories. It's like going into warp speed and trying to grab one of those stars that are whizzing past. Which one do I grab onto first?
That sounds like a Jason question. You're welcome.
We're a 3-person team. We're crazy busy. I know earlier you alluded to like, what does a day for me look like? And there is no such thing as a regular day. Sometimes I'll wake up in the morning and I'll be like, all right, we're 3 and out on the stills, no big deal there. We're gonna, maybe we're gonna taste on some barrels, work on a blend. Got a phone call at noon regular normal day. And then everything goes haywire. As a part of my job, I'm just kind of, I am the perfect definition of a jack of all trades, and which I will remind you, the back end of that statement is master of none. So like growing up as a farm kid, that means like I'm essentially a terrible plumber. I'm an even worse electrician, but I know just enough to get myself into trouble.
Yes.
But also I know just enough to sometimes get myself out of trouble as well. So sometimes that means I'm doing a little bit of plumbing work, or I'm rewiring a switch, or I spoke today at ACSA this morning, and I was like, sometimes when you're the master distiller, that means that you're the person that, I tell everybody to leave the building and I take my shirt off because there's a clog in the drain, and you have to get like below your shoulder and then some into your receiver to try to unclog the drain. And I am absolutely not going to ask the wonderful men that work with me to do that, because if I'm not willing to do it, how dare I ask them?
There you go. Absolutely.
I'm still absolutely happy to do the grossest, most awful job. But Garrett and Everett are really amazing. They're a really great team. We're a really great team, all of us together. So we kind of go, as far as Clear Creek Distillery and everything that we make, we're going with the flow of the seasons. We follow the fruit seasons, and everything that we're making, all the raw materials for Clear Creek, everything comes from within 200 miles of the distillery. And we're very connected to our farmer partners. We're very connected to the local agriculture.
Sure.
So if they have a great year, Clear Creek's going to have a great year. If they have a miserable year, we will be mourning with them. The best example of that is cherry seasons. Cherries are the most volatile thing I think that we work with. And even from the perspective of a cherry farmer, I've heard them talk about a cherry farmer is very successful if you have one good year in 7, which for the rest of us running a regular business, that seems absolutely bonkers.
That is.
But a good year is a very good year. And cherries are super, super fragile. And they're the most fragile through the early and late through spring. Let's just say spring, right? Sure. And we all know that spring, pretty much no matter where you are, is tumultuous. It's a season of change. And so you're having your main growing season during the season of change, where you have windstorms and rainstorms and surprise hail and sleet and maybe late snow. And that's when they're trying to blossom, trying to grow. All that to say, some years when we want 70,000 pounds of cherries, we only get 10,000 pounds of cherries.
Wow.
And we do our best. We do our best with what we have. And we have really great lines of communication between our farmer partners and ourselves. I find that, being a farm kid, I'm already paying attention to the weather. But, when I see a windstorm, high wind warning, and it's, the end of May, I am probably having the same restless night that most of those farmers are having, because I'm just as worried about the cherries as they are, getting knocked around and bruised and stuff right before harvest. So
we've spent some time talking to the whiskey supply sisters in Colorado, Felicia and Stephanie over there, and they've talked about losing, 100 acres of corn, or knowing somebody lost 160 acres of corn, like a full field of it, or just what can happen completely out of nowhere. And the fact that you've grown up in a farm life and then moved into a distilling life, is there a part of you, do you think, that maybe likes this high intensity action? No. Really? You don't think there's a slight thrill to be had there?
I think I'm inured to it, right?
So if not you, then whom?
Yeah, right? Like, I think I'm used to it. It's a part of my life at this point in time. I'm sure I'm going to die 15 years younger than I'm supposed to because of the stress of it. But it feels normal. It's my normal. Wow. So I don't know if I crave it, but I'm used to it.
I think it's a specific genetic stock that I think can live with that.
Yeah.
Like even Felicia and Stephanie just saying, you roll up your sleeves, you go back to work.
You get to work. I mean, there's a great, I can't remember, I think it was a late night, I don't remember what late night TV show it was, but it was a late night TV show interview of Nick Offerman. And he came from, Midwestern farming stock as well. And he made a comment, and it's always really resonated with me, because I've been there multiple times. But he's like, you'll be sitting by what used to be a field and is now all of a sudden a river, because for the last 3 days it's just been nothing but torrential downpour, and you and your family will be watching your entire year's crop just wash away in this new river. And you just stare at it for a second and you nod and you go, well, that happened, and you just get back to work and you figure out what you're going to do. Like that is absolutely the farming life. Like, you can try to control everything, and whatever happens is going to happen, and you're going to do your best.
What a skill set. What an ability for a distiller to have.
Oh, absolutely. When if you're, I was in the middle of doing my first ever interview to hire some staff. I'd never been a part of an interview process before on that side of the table. And we had the Zoom call all set up. I was running the distillery by myself, cherry season, because of course I was. So it was blazing hot in the distillery. And this wonderful person that I was interviewing had absolutely no idea that about 10 minutes before the Zoom call was going to start, the distillery clogged. And so the drains, all of the receivers and drains in the distillery were slowly filling up as I was, what I felt was being very professional, and did a full hour interview via Zoom, knowing full well that I had already called RØDE and that they were on the way, and I was getting text updates of when they were going to be there. And that ended up being a 14-and-a-half-hour day, as I was eventually, as the day turned to night, and I was on my belly with the RØDE team, which are amazing, by the way. Shout out to Adrian. He's my Lord and Savior.
Another sponsor of the podcast.
Another sponsor of the podcast, RØDE. On our bellies in the middle of whatever was coming out of those drains, trying to fix it, right? You just never know what's going to happen, but you just do it. You just do what you can. You do your best.
So speaking of that, when you've now got the 10,000 pounds instead of the 70,000 pounds of cherries, do you supplement? Are you
Nope, that's just
on
however
the phone?
much that we can make that year.
That's just the production.
That's what you can make that year. Yeah. So the distillery follows the seasons. Cherries and all the berries for all of the cores are going to be in the summertime. In the late fall is usually when everything is ripe. So we process some whole grapes for Muscat grappa that we do. So that happens. It's usually the first thing that happens, and then it's nothing but pears from September to February. Apples last longer in storage. We go into apples as soon as pears are done, and then we're usually poking in plums, because we have that's the only fruit material that we have pre-processed for us. That's the one thing that we give. We forgive our plumbing, and we do get our plums Elliott pitted. So we are dealing with cherry pits, but we aren't dealing with plum pits.
Oh God.
So plums are usually in the springtime, and then we have Doug Fir picking and processing wine and making our single malts, and then we've rounded the corner again. But we're also making those Amaros and aperitivos. We're making Timberline vodka. We have a Lewis and Clark premium vodka we also make from the company, and then we're no longer doing the production on a source sourced bourbon line called Trail's End. We're not doing the main finishing at our facility. That's down at our sister, at the main bottling plant. But we are doing any of the R&D for that product line, as well as any other new product lines for the company as well. We are the nerdy brain trust at the distillery. And so even if we're not making it there, we are where it starts before we deliver that information to the main bottling plant for scaling.
So many moving parts and so many. Is the benefit of so many moving parts, and clearly hearing about the cherries, that when you see a shortfall in one place, you and your team are looking at where do we make up this shortfall?
It's kind of just a constant puzzle.
Is it peaks and troughs for the 12 months, the budget year?
Yep. Yeah, it is the farmer's way. It's the best we can with what we've got. And we always stay busy. I try to keep us from being too busy. Try to keep, regular, at least for the team, try to keep their hours fairly regular. But as a part of my job, I'm also doing the brand work for the Instagram pages. I'm also doing...
You are?
Yes. Yeah, so if you've ever wondered who is the crazy person behind the Instagram accounts, that's me. And so I'm doing all the content for 3 brand accounts on Instagram, as well as doing the compliance paperwork for my distillery. And then we have a sister distillery up in Seattle called Captive Spirits that makes gin. So I'm doing the paperwork for that distillery as well.
Oh my gosh.
And then I get to travel around the world and speak to wonderful people like you, and come to the American Craft Spirits Association conference and give a presentation on, the breaking down your brand story and how to best communicate that brand story when you're an overexcitable nerd that is very excited about all of those fine details. But it's, you can't overwhelm somebody with all the fine details that we find exciting. So.
Okay, so I now know my 2 next and what will be final lines. Not to race, I'm dedicating 20, 30 minutes to this. But before we get there, Amaro. I don't want to sit and ask you questions about...
I love the romance in which you introduce that word.
Come on.
Yes.
It's a very romantic spirit.
Oh, wait, no, it totally is.
It's well worth
the taste of after dinner wherever you happen to be in Italy.
Right.
It's deeply romantic.
Like, it's so good, such a good product. So without asking you questions about everything in your portfolio, I definitely do, because I'm so interested in Amaro, and I enjoy, a Black Manhattan, right? It's my absolute go-to. I'm so terrible at remembering cocktails. It's one of my go-to because it's 3 ingredients that I almost can't fuck up. If I haven't made it for a while, I do sometimes double check, but it's so delicious. And Amaro's doing such heavy lifting in there. But Amaro itself is so good. What's your relationship like with Amaro, and what's important in the production of Amaro? And then perhaps, and I'm going to mirror this in just a second, what's the story you find yourself, Ms. Brand Management over here?
Sure.
What kind of stories do you find telling? How do you find a presentation around Amaro? So three kind of little teaser bits on Amaro there.
So the Amaro project, and they're a pair. So it's an Amaro and an aperitivo, right? Aperitivo being something similar to like a Campari.
Okay,
right?
with you.
And the really neat part of that project is we have partnered with Dale DeGroff, King Cocktail himself, and Ted Bro, who is the godfather of American absinthe. He's the reason that we have fully legal, appropriate absinthe in the United States. He's the one that lobbied the FDA to include the Grand Wormwood in the recipe here in the United States. An amazing team, the both of them, right? Dale being largely responsible for the reason we have a cocktail culture at all in the United States.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then Ted being the absolute brains behind absinthe and also using all these botanicals in spirits. And so the two of them, of course, they're friends, because why wouldn't they be friends? And the two of them got to chatting, and they really wanted to explore the Amaro and aperitivo space. And for Dale DeGroff, he had never actually, despite been giving plenty of opportunities to put his name on a product over the years, had always said no to it. And so over the pandemic, like maybe too much time on their hands for two men with big brains and lots of movement in their lives, and they decided to work on this Amaro and Aperitivo together. And Hood River Distillers is the partner for Ted Bro for the Jade Absinthe and most importantly the Lucid Absinthe. And so when they were talking about, well, who are we going to take this to? Who's going to make this with us? Ted already had the connection to Hood River Distillers, but I mean, I'm going to take them at their word because I know it to be true. But the first thing that they thought of was, well, of course, we're going to take it to Clear Creek Distillery. And so they came to us with their kitchen recipes, and then the team at Clear Creek brought those recipes to life on the large scale,
Wonderful.
right? So taking our expertise and what we know and working with two absolute legends to bring these wonderful products to life. For both of them, the really cool thing is that they are made from real herbs and spices. So there's nothing artificial, there's no artificial color. I am used to there being a threshold of education for products because I make brandy and a smoky, peaty American single malt. So I'm used to always having to take 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps with any consumer I'm talking to try to meet them where they are in their journey of learning and guide them one more step to let them know that brandy isn't scary and peat also isn't a dirty word.
100% on both.
And so when explaining the Amaro and the Aperitivo, the Amaro, I mean, people are fairly used to like an inky black Amaro, right? This Amaro in particular, we're calling it a New World Amaro because the only thing I'm allowed to tell you as a part of the recipe is that there is some allspice in it. So we're digging into some of those kind of New World spices with this Amaro. It's really delicious. I joke. I know it's going to be good in coffee, and I've had it in an espresso martini, and it is absolutely amazing. But I've never actually put it in my morning coffee because I'm like, I live in the place where it's made, and that just seems like a bad idea. But Garrett, one of my distillers, he's heard me make that joke so many times that he actually on a weekend did it, and then he came back to me and he puts his hand on my arm and he's like, "Bartlemay, don't do it. I did it. You're right, but you don't need to know how right you are." And I'm like, totally fair. I appreciate the feedback. Good to know.
It's so tempting.
No, absolutely. But like when you have I only have one cup of coffee in the morning, and when that only one happens across from a table that has a bottle on it, like I'm not going to rip that Band-Aid off. But with the Aperitivo, especially with Campari essentially setting the bar on that, there's an expectation of what the color and the clarity of that. And so we spend a lot of time being like, we understand that this isn't day glow orange, and it doesn't necessarily look as attractive as a spritz as you might expect it to be. But it is so aromatic and it is so flavorful because it is made from all of these real botanicals, all these real spices and peels and flowers and all the things that make a really good botanical product a really good botanical product. And so it's been a blast to not only get to know Ted and Dale a little bit more intimately, having actually working on the project with them, but also to get to know those products on the larger scale and be able to play with them and talk about them. Oh, yeah. I can't remember. I did bring a handful of things
right now.
To share. I don't remember if I actually managed to get. I think I might have managed to leave the Amaro at home. So we'll have to put that on the list of things that I need to get into your hemisphere.
Well, actually, with that said, and we will use it as a transition.
Perfect.
You were very kind in December to send Joshua and myself some McCarthy samples, and we're actually going to have a follow-up episode to this interview where Joshua and I are going to taste through those 3 offerings that you sent over. And so face to face, I will thank you on behalf of myself and Joshua. We look forward to tasting those and discussing. However, with that little tease placed, let's transition into this final bifurcation where I want to talk about Clear Creek. I want to talk about PT, American single malt whiskey. But then I also do want to talk to you more about the branding of such and the presentation of such. But I don't want to lose the geeky whiskey chat because I know I'm still sitting in front of a distiller. But I definitely want to hear your experience in the branding of that. So could you give our listeners, again, the quick, how did Clear Creek come to be, if that remains important. I know we've talked
Absolutely.
about Steve being kind of a bastion of this category. So I want to give him his due and give him his respect.
Oh, absolutely. There is nothing that I will enjoy more than giving Steve his due. He owes, or I owe him as much as many of the people that have gone through Clear Creek owe him our careers, and I owe him our passion.
Yeah, mensch,
and to be honest, there are so many people that I still meet out in craft distilling that never worked for Clear Creek, but had the opportunity to meet Steve, and it was a very poignant moment in their distilling journey as well. So
absolutely,
he's not just important to me and my team and anybody that's been a part of the team, but to a great deal of the craft distilling scene. So Steve McCarthy, he had traveled Europe extensively with another company that he had owned, and he sold that company and was essentially afforded an early retirement at the ripe old age of 40 if he so chose. But we know those kinds of people aren't ones to fold everything up and go fishing every day instead. And, through falling in love with spirits and knowing that an arm of his family tree was growing pears in the Hood River Valley, and he loved Williams Pear Brandy, which is actually, Williams Pear is the same as the Bartlett Pear. If you check out Artisan Spirits magazine, I just had an article released on the curious history of the Bartlett Pear, because I think it's funny. It's had several names over the years. And so he was like, all right, well, it can't be that hard to start a distillery and make my own pear brandy, right? Starting the third craft distillery in the country. Wow. And certainly a huge advantage, Jorg Rupf being such a giving and wonderful man. He'd already founded St. George, which is the first craft distillery in the country. And so Steve reached out to Jorg Rupf to be like, hey, I think I want to do a fruit distillery here in Portland, Oregon. And Jorg, very giving of his time, came up to Portland, helped Steve buy the equipment that he needed, helped him through his first fermentations, and helped troubleshoot things. So definitely when you talk about like spreading the seeds of joy and brandy distilling, like we absolutely owe Jorg Rupf and his charitable nature a debt of gratitude, and that he's been so giving to so many people over his entire career with Clear Creek and everybody that's been there as a part of that. But Steve founded Clear Creek Distillery in 1985, and with the original kind of fruit brandy lineup, we've got pear, plum, cherry, and then a couple aged apple brandies in French oak casks. So sort of mirroring the European style, but putting our own American twist on it. All of them whole fruit fermentations. And then on a trip to Ireland in the early 90s, because him and his wife, both avid adventurers, avid hikers and mountaineers, they were planning on doing a bunch of hiking. Well, the weather was, in fact, poorer than they even expected it to be, even though Ireland is known for lots of rain. And lucky for them, they were staying with a friend that was an avid single malt collector. And so, well, I guess we're not going to be able to be walking the green hillsides of Ireland. I guess we'll just have to help ourselves to all these beautiful whiskeys.
Gladly the backup plan.
Yeah, right? And so that's where Steve really fell in love with single malts. And in the early 90s, we're Portland, Oregon being, a booming center of craft beer. So there's all these craft breweries coming up. And he's like, all right, well, we've got these brewers. We probably have maltsters as well. There's definitely barley that grows in Oregon. There's absolutely peat in Oregon, because you can just about grow anything in Oregon, which is kind of fun. Wouldn't it be cool if I came back and made my own single malt? And the rest is essentially written in history. Unfortunately for him, there was no malt houses that were willing to take on Oregon peat and Oregon barley, because then every craft beer out of Portland would be smoking peaty. You cannot get that peat reek out of a system once you've introduced it. And so the original batches, and every batch of McCarthy's has been made from 100% peat malted barley that we've imported from Scotland.
Nice.
We've always worked with brewery partners, because we are mostly a winery that makes we're making whole fruit wine that we're then distilling. And so it's never really made sense for us to have the grain handling facilities on site. And a big tenet of the brand of Clear Creek Distillery is that community effort, right? We're working with all these farmer partners. We're trying to showcase all of the work that all of the local agriculture does in a spirit that we can then share around the world, because it's awful hard to share an apple on the other side of the planet, right? But it's way easier to share a bottle of apple brandy.
Indeed.
And so working with brewery partners it just feels like a natural part of how we do business and how we choose to do business. Sure. We were working with the Widmer brothers early on, and then for the last 10 years or so, we've been working with Double Mountain Brewery in Hood River. And Very pleased with the wash they create. So they handle all of the grain. We get the fermented wash from them, and then we're distilling it. A single pass on our Arnold Holstein brandy stills. So we pretty much start breaking the rules immediately. The bulk proof is between 148 and 150. And then we're using our glacial fed spring water to bring it down to our maturing strength. And it goes into 100% Oregon oak casks. And those are not charred, they are only toasted. So Oregon oak is actually very similar to French oak in the way that the tree grows. So with American oak, you have those hard tyloses, those plugs at the end of the straws that build the structure of a tree. With French oak and Oregon oak, the plugs on the ends of those straws are actually fairly soft and malleable. And as those staves are being seasoned in the yard over a couple of years, those tyloses, which is what those caps are called, will start to break down. And so with both French oak and Oregon oak, there's no need to damage the wood grain to the extent with charring to be able to get the penetration of the spirit through the wood grain. And so you're getting that deeper penetration. The flavor profile is very different between the two of them, but the way that those trees grow, very similar. And in fact, down to the way that those barrels are coopered, because for French oak, they're a little bit more, wasteful is maybe not fair to say, but they have to, with American oak, everything's quarter sawn, right? And so you're gonna get a certain amount of staves out of every log, and those trees, bless them, they grow fairly straight. Right? Oregon oak trees have a mind of their own. Okay. And with Oregon and French oak, they have to be split along the grain, however the grain wants to split. And so you're not going to get as many barrels for as many yards of wood brought out of the forest, because depending on how that grain wants to split, you're going to have a little bit more attrition, a little bit more loss on the wood as you're trying to make those staves go into those barrels. So really interesting commonality there between those two, even though the flavors and chemistry behind both very, very, very different. So McCarthy's aged 100% in both new and used Oregon oak cooperage. That's all medium toast. And the original flagship released at 3 years, and then in 21 we released the first ever older age statement at 6 years. And then we've had 2 sherry cask finishes of the 6-year, and Oloroso and Pedro Jimenez. I shipped you guys the Pedro Jimenez.
Yes.
The Oloroso was a much smaller release, and unfortunately for you, we don't have a whole lot of it left. It's now the highest rated, and still actually for the last 18 months, the highest rated American single malt in the history of the Whiskey Advocate.
Oh, well done.
And it was young Mr. Garrett Trotter's first ever blend of McCarthy's.
Oh my gosh.
So very, very proud of the next generation of Clear Creek distillers coming through. There's a lot of talent that we're very blessed to have. But McCarthy's is an amazing story. I feel like it's a story that not only resonates with those of us that work there and love it, but also just with the American single malt category, especially now that we've seen ratification. Exactly.
Which we've been celebrating every day since we got the news.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Yeah. The protocols were in place in January. And I think we will be hanging out with the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission
Tuesday
tomorrow.
Night is the commission meeting.
So I brought one of last year's single cask balcones.
Awesome.
To pour for that.
I won't on the record tell you what I'm bringing.
Okay. I'm excited to taste it. Very, very quickly, because I always like to have a follow-up and my mind is always racing. I've got 3 very quick things.
Sure.
Number 1 was Steve has used Oregon oak from the beginning.
Correct.
That's remarkable, right? And I feel like, and I think this is what we talk about where a rising tide lifts all ships. There's a very good chance I was told that and it washed right over me. In paying attention to Westland and Gariana releases, and we've got Oregon oak there, now it resonates and I'm thinking, and now to be perfectly honest with you, I'm a little embarrassed to have sung the praises of McCarthy's and to have had that detail wash over me. And so it's good to have ongoing conversations where you say, this is how you build a category, right? You hear it over there the first time and you nod your head. You hear it somewhere else and you hear it enough times, you go, okay, yeah, I get it. And then you hear it back in the original place and you go, oh, shit, okay. I should be smarter. Okay.
No. There are so many, and that's a really great tie-in when you talk about the brand story, and also one of the what I'm presenting on here at ACSA is that there are so many details, and and when you're sharing your brand story with somebody, it's more about asking yourselves what you know about the person you're talking to and where they are in their journey of learning, right?
Exactly.
Because I could sit here and overwhelm somebody with all kinds of science, and it's kind of like a rain gauge. If you want to fill it up as much as you can, but as soon as you fill it up, because it's a rain gauge, it's going to tip over. It's measuring water, and you're not going to remember some of it and then lose the rest of it. You're going to remember none of it because you're just going to remember being overwhelmed by too much information.
Yeah, the revisiting is the key element here.
And so when I have the opportunity to talk to people on podcasts or out in the field and bartenders and restaurateurs, it's all to me about figuring out where somebody is on their journey of learning about spirits, grabbing them by the hand and just taking them one more step. I don't need to give them a master's degree in distilling in an hour, but I would love if they were interested just enough to maybe ask me a couple questions, because then they're going to tell me what they found interesting, and I can give them that little treat, that little bit of information that's going to leave them inspired to learn more instead of it being turned off by the amount of information they didn't know that they didn't know.
Yep. Nope. Spot on. Absolutely spot on. And so I'm going to pivot from a detail that seemingly washed over me to something that stuck with me, and I hope I'm remembering it correctly. Mm-hmm. Does McCarthy's have a lower barrel fill strength than I might be accustomed to from somewhere like Scotland? Where for Scotland filling at 63.5, 126 proof. Mm-hmm. Did Steve fill at 100 proof?
Yeah, so back in the day, we were filling at 100 proof. Okay. We moved up to 110 shortly, I think it was maybe right before or right after I joined the team in 2010. Okay. So we did move up to 110 proof, so 55. Okay. When we were in Portland, being a little bit cooler, a little bit more temperate climate, and also a little bit more humidity, we were actually slowly losing proof, so a little bit more similar to what a Scottish single malt might experience.
Indeed.
Now that we're on the other side of the rain shadow, we're on the other side of the Cascade Mountains in Hood River, it's a little bit warmer. Brilliant. We're getting a little bit more of that broader temperature change, and also definitely less humidity. And so we're actually gaining.
There you go.
We're gaining not a whole lot, depending on the cask, maybe 1 or 2 over a 4-year period. So it's still slow, and we're not worried about it as far as a change over time. I would say, we've been in Hood River now for 7 years. So there's been several releases of McCarthy's of both age statements. We're coming up on our first release of an 8-year that's only lived in Hood River. And I don't think anybody's really noticed that it's changed the flavor profile a whole lot. So we're not worried about it, but from the whiskey nerd side of things, it's really cool. Because we're only 50 miles away from where our distillery started in Portland in the same state.
Right, and the thing for me is never to point a finger and never to say that's not right. For me, it's always I'm really curious why that was Steve's number. Mm-hmm. And I think the way you've just explained this so beautifully, and the reason for the change. Mm-hmm. Listen, we're so early on, even with, the third craft producer in this country, we can count it in 3 and 4 decades. Yep. There's a long way to go here, and a lot of things are going to happen. Mm-hmm. Final question on that, my little trident of questions.
I do have one more thing before your last question. Yes. The cool thing about McCarthy's, and it's something that I have kind of come to really fully understand, is that when you're trying to explain McCarthy's as an American single malt, it's really, again, the rings of Saturn. It's very important to understand that it's being made by brandy distillers in brandy stills. So it's a lower entry proof because we're trying to make sure that we're getting that balance between the extractives of the ethanol and water soluble things, right? And especially when you're talking about élevage, when you're doing that slow proofing. We're not doing slow proofing in cask, but that was the idea of that lower entry proof, was to essentially save us the work, but get that really nice even spread between ethanol soluble and water soluble cask flavors.
Makes great sense.
And the other thing with that is that we are making brandy cuts on our stills. So we're making incredibly tight cuts on our stills. We're making a proper heads cut and a definitive tails cut. We're not making any kind of fatty cuts. And that's one of the really cool things about McCarthy's, is that the overwhelming amount of copper contact, as well as a tight cut on the tails, means that we're including that smoky peaty characteristic, but instead of being a little bit more like fusel and barnyardy.
Yep.
It's much more like an old growth forest.
Absolutely, 100%.
So it's a really interesting way to approach that style, and it really is for hardcore whiskey fans. McCarthy's might not make sense, but if you put it in the context of being a beautiful peated single malt made by brandy distillers, maybe that's the bridge that they need to understand what we're trying to do and why McCarthy's is so beautiful.
I think you're spot on, and I appreciate everything you say there. The very first time I tasted it and spoke to Steve about it, and you just said old growth forest here. I told Steve to his face, it made me think of a Highland peated malt rather than an Islay peated malt. And it had the wood experience there. It had a heather smoke going on to it there. I thought the feeling of provenance to it made a lot of sense. And even though we were standing in the city of Portland, it made sense for Oregon. It made sense of the fact you can drive 45 minutes outside of Portland and you're at Multnomah Falls and you're in a forest and you've got a waterfall. It's amazing. Like, I'm very passionate about Oregon. I got married in Portland.
Oh, wonderful.
And so, when I was courting my wife, my parents-in-law were living in Portland and Tigard. And so I love that place. I love visiting that place. And I haven't visited
so you're going to love
since
this.
moving away.
I explain the smoke characteristic with McCarthy's as it's near dusk and you're in an old growth forest and you're close enough to the campfire that you can hear your friends laughing, but you're far enough away that you can't hear what they're laughing about. And it's that kind of damp and snoozy and comforting kind of whiff of smoke that's coming off that campfire, almost like a Looney Tunes cartoon when you see the pie smell.
Absolutely.
And it just kind of goes underneath your nose and teases you and wants to bring you back to the glass. That is the description, for me, of the smoke characteristic that we get in McCarthy's.
Makes great sense. Terrific sense.
Okay, now that I've interrupted your third question.
No, you were right. No. Mine was just the trident on the part. This was you and me not trying to get too geeky about the single malt production side of things, but I was just curious, and I think our listeners might be too, in hearing about how long McCarthy's has been produced. And you talked a moment ago about we got an old one, like we made a move to 3, and then we put out an old one and it was 6. Where does the ethos around age lie for you at McCarthy's? What are you finding in the casks, and what story are you looking to tell about that whiskey at those particular ages?
So with the 3-year, that was a decision I think mostly informed by the Scots, right? 3-year being what you guys are used to. So I think that was definitely what Steve was copying at the time.
Exactly.
So that's why we have the 3-year. It is beautiful and delicious. It was named best whiskey in the country multiple times, and sold out on day one for many, many, many years. The 6, we love working with independent bottlers, and when Lost Lantern first started, and them being friends as well, they came to us, and we weren't sure what we wanted to do with an older age statement, but they were excited to work with us on a 6-year. And we had a few barrels that we're holding to just kind of use as experiments to see what an older McCarthy's might actually look like. And so the first ever 6-year McCarthy's actually was a single barrel release through Lost Lantern.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's nice.
So really, really wonderful bit of history that they get to share with us. And then it was like maybe 2 years later, I think, before we actually released our 6-year-old McCarthy's.
Oh, awesome.
But when it comes to where we think that McCarthy's, where I think that McCarthy's is going to go as far as older age statements, it really goes back to the ethos of how we approach aging any whiskey, or even doing all the finishes that we do across all the different brands that Hood River Distillers has and that Clear Creek is a part of, in that we are listening to the whiskey. It doesn't matter if we have orders that are at the door, salespeople that are at our heels saying, we need to get this done. The container is leaving, the ship is leaving, we have to do this now, the month, the numbers, the month, whatever. Right. We absolutely refuse, from leadership all the way down, to release something that we're not happy with. And no matter what we're doing, we are listening to the whiskey. And so I don't know what the oldest age statement of McCarthy's will be. We still have some barrels that are essentially our Voyager probe into space and time on what an older McCarthy's could be. We do check in on them fairly regularly, but we're going to let the whiskey tell us when it's done. And for those that have spent time as blenders or as whiskey makers, if you have the opportunity to pay attention to taste throughout those aging, you just know, like you just have a feeling of when it's time, and you'll listen to the whiskey tell you when it's time. So right now we have a 6 that's in bottle. We did release a specialty one-off for the Whiskey Lodge last year, which was all the primary maturation was actually in an X rum cask, and there's a few cases of that still available online. And that was nearly 7 years. So that I think is probably the oldest age statement that is out on the market, ready to sell. But I'm hoping, in the next couple of years, you'll see something that's a little bit older from McCarthy's.
Well, and I think every whiskey fan wants to hear you say the whiskey tells the story. The whiskey leads the charge here. We could want to have a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old and a 30-year-old. It might not fit the whiskey. So why would you do it for the sake of a label if it doesn't work for the whiskey? In the interest of full disclosure for our listeners, you and I are meant to be done at a certain time because there's an event happening here connected to the ACSA. I'm listening to the doorbell pinging away here, and I know it's time for us to wrap it up. But would you mind, just for a couple of moments, could you quickly, and I hate to use that term because we're so busy and we do such important things and we're so passionate, could you quickly talk about the brand management of an American single malt whiskey? And we talked about the ratification of the category. Can you tie a bow using those two threads to our wonderful conversation?
I think it really ties back into the reason that we're all in this, the reason that we're doing it, the reason we're all so passionate, right? There is over 250 producing distilleries making single malt across the United States.
Indeed.
Which means that there are even more than that, thousands of people that have been excited about American single malt and have been drinking this for decades, right? We're 31 years after the first American single malt was ever distilled, and that was McCarthy's in '94. And so with the ratification, we knew it wasn't going to be some miraculous kind of silver bullet that all of a sudden was going to, blow all of our sales out of the water with the ratification. But because we were already passionate as producers about making it, and the consumers were already passionate about learning more. And so I think when you're talking about American single malt just on a broad term and building that brand, I love the creativity of it, and I love that this is a spirit category that's been defined by the people that make it, that love it the most, and they had the opportunity to potentially legislate their way into making this difficult for new people to be entrants into the field. And instead, because of their love of American single malt and the development of that flavor, chose to create rules and to focus on rules that still leave opportunities for creativity and leave opportunities to actually get a sense of the provenance of the United States, right? What Westland is doing up in Seattle versus what we're seeing here with Del Bach, right? So different and beautiful and equals, right? And I know from the perspective of a customer, it's maybe a little bit difficult. You want to try an American single malt. And my saying has been, I couldn't wait for the day that we have a standard of identity, but I hope that there's never a whiskey that's the standard of identity for American single malt. I hope that there's never a flavor that you can expect out of every American single malt, because the point of this category, the reason that there are 41 countries making single malt, the reason that there's over 900 producing single malt distilleries around the world is because all of us whiskey nerds are absolutely romanced with the amount of complex flavors and the amount of change that you can get from area to area, from region, from barrel aging climate in this seemingly very simple whiskey, right? It is 100% malted barley. It is a bit of water, and it's some thyme in an oak barrel.
Preach, sister, preach.
That is, I guess, when you talk about American single malt, it is about celebrating the creativity and ingenuity of passionate people across the United States. And no matter what, I feel like that comes across with all these brands when we spend time educating the American consumer about what single malt is. And that's what people are keying into.
The listener couldn't see you, but I'm sure they could hear you leaning forward and lifting out of your seat as you were getting more and more passionate in that presentation as well. Our mutual friend Anna said we would get on like a house on fire. This has been the easiest and shortest 60 minutes of any recording, and they're dragging chairs around out here. More people are coming in the building. Sincere thanks for your time, Caitlin. It was a joy to spend time with you, and I look
Thank you
forward
so much.
to the next couple of days hanging out with you as well.
Absolutely. No, this has been a privilege and a joy to be on here and have the opportunity to speak with you in person.
Brilliant. Well, dear listeners, please listen into the next episode where we give the McCarthy's bottles a good old tasting, a good old discussion. We're really excited to get deep into those and have a tremendous conversation. In the meantime, if you want to reach out, if you want to begin a conversation with us, please drop us a note, info@singlecasknation.com. We always love to hear from you. We love knowing that you're out there listening to these interviews with magnificent whiskey people like Caitlin. And until the next time, I will get out of here by saying a cheers without having a glass to clang. Cheers, nation. Later.